Hello, this is Mickey. How's everybody doing? Over the last several months, we've covered several tools and application processes in Lightroom to process photos. But I have gotten emails and notes lately saying, well, that's all well and good, but could you just show us how to put this all together by processing a photo from beginning to end? And I'm telling you, nobody wants to sit and watch a video for 30 or 40 minutes, but I will process this photo and I'll kind of speed it up in places that we're doing repetitive things, but just give you an idea of how I would process this photo, and maybe that will help you see how we can use these tools to really bring out the color and texture and tonality of a photograph. To start out with, the first thing that I usually do is that I will go to the Develop module and I will go to the crop tool and crop this down to the way I want it. And you can also use the shortcut tool of R, and that brings in the crop tool. Now, when I took this picture, I thought this reflection would be part of the subject matter, but the more and more I think about it and talking to friends, it just really isn't. So we're going to take the crop all the way up to this point and get rid of the water. And then we're going to bring the side in about like this, and I'm going to slide it over a little bit, bringing the painter a little bit more towards the rule of thirds into the first third. It's been a kind of 50-50 with my friends on whether this limb should remain. I kind of like it, so I'm going to leave it there. Now, after I get it cropped, the next thing I like to do is I like to choose my profile. Today, we're going to use the adaptive color profile. This is the latest color profile given by Adobe, and it works really well, especially in landscape photographs. Not on all photographs, but on some it works really well. So let's go ahead and choose that. And as you can see, it does a really good job. It enhances the color, gives me better contrast, a nicer sky. And you also have a slider to increase or decrease the effect of that profile. So I'm going to bump it up to about 130, about like that. The next thing I like to do is use my lens correction for remove chromatic aberration and enable profile corrections. Then I use transform to help straighten up the image. And the last thing I do before I start masking is I use my calibration tool. And this is such a great little magic tool that affects color at the pixel level. So we're going to start out our blue primary, and what we do is I just swing this back and forth just to see what I get. Of course, that's too much and that's not enough. So we'll just bring it up a little bit. We don't want the red rocks to get too red, and we don't want things to get too green. Now we take our green primary slider, and you can see a lot, it affects a lot there. So we're just going to bump this just a little bit, maybe 10. And then red, of course, you know what's going to happen here. There it goes. The red rocks go nuclear on us. So I'm just going to take this to about a 10 also, about like that. So that's my base. From here, I start working on individual pieces. What we've done so far are all global changes. Now I want to start on local changes using the mask. I like to work from the top down. So the first thing I'm going to do is the sky. Now, when I look at a sky, if it's a blue sky, I use one mask. If it's a blue sky with clouds, I typically make two masks. So I make one mask and then I make a duplicate, and I'll show you how we go about that. So I'm going to go to the mask here. I'm going to go to the sky. You can see it makes a really good mask, but it's not quite perfect. Let's go over to black and white, or white on black, and you can see it's not all in the bush here. It's not catching everything in the rocks. The best way to get this clean that I found most of the time, and there are several different ways, but I like to go up to the mask, the three little dots, and choose intersect with the sky. Watch this. See how well it cleaned it up? Cleaned up almost everything. If you wanted to go in and use a brush, you could brush that in better, but I don't think it's a really big deal. So let's go back out to our color overlay, and you can see this bush didn't get really all the color in here. That's another way to clean up. I can show you that. Let's grab, we want to add to the mask because we want to add the mask within here. We click add by brush. We want to make sure our auto mask is on, because whatever that plus mark, whatever color is under that plus mark, that's what's going to be applied to the mask. So we're going to make our brush really big so we can be touching the cloud and still cover the bush. So, and all we do is click. Now when I click, you see that? It filled in everything in between here, but it left what wasn't blue sky or cloud, it left it alone. So the limbs and the leaves were left alone. Just another good way to make your mask a little cleaner. Now like I said, because we have a blue sky and a cloud, I'm going to go ahead and make a duplicate mask. I'm going to call this first mask, double click on it, I'm going to call it sky. The second mask I made, I'm going to call it clouds. We're going to do this real quick, just to save time. I'm going to go to tone. I'm going to bring my tone down a little bit. I'm going to bring the highlights down, shadows up a little bit, bring my whites up just a little bit. And I'm also going to go to point color. I'm going to grab here, and I'm going to shift my saturation just a little bit. And I'm going to shift the hue a little bit to make it a little more magenta, just a milder sky, probably about like this. And then I can use my luminance to make it brighter or darker. That's a little too magenta. About like that. Now we can go to our clouds mask, and here I'm going to intersect with color, and I'm going to pick a color of the cloud like right here. And as you can see, the mask is only applied to the clouds and not the sky. And from here you can, brighten or take away the contrast from your clouds, add shadows. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because we're kind of short. I'm just showing you how you can do it. And if you want to try to kind of get rid of this gray, again, you could go to the point color, pick that gray color, and decrease the saturation, and you can take that little gray out of the clouds. About like that. All right? Okay, so the next we want to look at is this rock here. Now, you can tell that the sun was on our right, coming in this way, because you can see where the sun is hitting here, and it's darker on the back side of the rock. So we want to try to duplicate or replicate that to bring more light into the scene, but not all the way across the rock. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to grab an object tool, and we're going to draw around this rock. I don't want that little fork in the center because that rock is actually between the two plateaus and it's not getting any sun anyway, so we're going to leave that alone. So we're just going to quickly draw around here with an object mask and then clean up. So you can see it didn't get everything, so we want to go down here to add with the brush. We want to make sure that auto mask is turned on, and we're just going to paint in those areas that were missed just like this, cleaning up our mask a little bit back here. And we can clean that right there. Now, because I said we're going to be using a mask to brighten this, we also need another mask to do the sun, the intersection. So we're going to go up here and say duplicate mask 1. We're going to call this mask, the original one, we'll just call this the mountain. We're just going to double click here, and we're going to call this the mountain. Oops, mountain. And then we're going to double click on this one, and we're just going to call this the sun. All right, and I'll show you how we do that in just a second. So let's go back to our mountain, and we're going to just do some very basics to here. We're going to add a little light, not much. We'll try to increase the contrast to make it more realistic looking. And I might throw a little clarity in here, not too much because it's going to brighten it up and I don't want to brighten it up. But we'll use texture, and you start to see all those fine points of rocks and the striation, and that's what we want. All right, so that's what I like as far as how the rock looks. Let's see if we just give it a little golden color, about like that. All right, so now we want to light this rock up. To do that, we go to the other mask that we made, and we hit intersect with linear gradient, and we want to draw the gradient across like this. So we're going to draw the gradient. As I draw it across, you can see where the magenta is where the light's going to hit, and you can see the light is falling off as we move across the mountain. And you just need to adjust this till you get it about like you want, and then you add some light. So we'll add a little exposure, we'll add a little highlights, maybe some whites. And from here, we can start making adjustments to our linear gradient. How much of feather do we want on this, and how much light we want it to hit. And for me, I could be fiddling with this in an hour, to tell you the truth. You can use your amount slider like this. Let's see if we add a little more contrast to this. So if we look at our before, and after, probably could add a little more sun on the rock face. And you can either do that with your sliders, or you can do that by bringing your gradient in to where more of that sun is hitting. So if we put our cursor over the center, we can see where that gradient is applied. And I'm just going to, just for the sake of it, I'm going to say about right here, about like that. So here's our before and our after, before and our after. That way we get to light up the front facing part of the rock without putting any more here. Now there's also some light hitting in different areas on the rock here, and I might just use a brush like this because I can see that there's some light coming across here. I'm going to take the flow down to about 50%. I'm just going to paint across right here like this, and you can increase the exposure a little bit. We have a little bit back here. Increase exposure. That just gives it a little more contrast change in depth. So here we before, after, and if we look at everything before, and after. The next thing I'm going to work on is our tree line. Now in this, I will use several masks, and I'll brush in the mask, and then I affect the color and luminance change with point color. So you have to pick your colors, and we'll pick this green first. Let's get a new brush, and we're going to pick this like light green here. We're going to paint it in with our brush, and once we get the area masked, we then use point color to make a very specific color change, and without affecting anything else. So I'm going to increase the saturation. I can increase the luminance like this, and we can do the same thing with every color. Now I'm not going to spend the time doing all of them, but what we can do is use another brush, and let's say we want to just affect the oranges. So here I'm painting the mask over the oranges, and that's what I usually do. I separate it by color and tonality, and then I make the changes. Right? And actually I'll make this a little orange too. So once you have it selected, you want to choose point color, select the color that you want to work with, and then you make your saturation, luminance, and hue changes. So you can see we can brighten these up if we want. And we'll do one more. We'll do yellows. So we're going to paint in on the yellows like this. See, it doesn't matter if we run over into the greens really too much, because we're going to use point color to select yellow, and that will really be the only color range that the mask is going to address. And I'll show you a little shortcut here in just a second on how we can affect other light colors without masking them beforehand. So we've colored in pretty much all the yellows. We're going to take our picker from point color, click on it, and now we can change our saturation, we can change our hue, and we can change our luminance. Now we painted in all these areas, and here's the shortcut. We didn't paint this area down here, we didn't paint this, but because we still have that brush active, we can paint on the yellows, and it will paint in just like the ones we had masked before. So it's kind of like masking on the fly. Another thing you can do, and I'll show you real quick, let's choose some of the greens with a brush, and we'll take this green area here and around here because they're lights, so we can create some contrast by making this lighter than the rest of the tree like this. Choose our color picker, and now we can add some luminosity, and you can see we can add contrast like the sun is hitting part of that tree and not all of it, and light is bending around the tree right here. But if we wanted to, because this is green, we can actually take the brush that we're using here and just hand paint on right like this, and we can brighten up these leaves the very same by like freehand masking is what I call it. And we're not really going into the sky because there's no green in the sky. So you don't have to be real careful about the colors. And that way, if we look at our before and after, before and after, and what you want to do is go through this whole area like that, picking out the different colors and using point color to narrow down what areas you're going to affect, and then change your hue, luminance, or saturation. The next thing we want to do, we want to darken down the front part of this photograph to give it more depth. And we're going to grab a linear gradient. We're going to come up like this, and we're going to darken it down. All right, about like this. Now, if you were looking at this prior to me putting that in, you can notice that there's a plateau here, that a beam of light was coming across from over here. You can see it's a lot lighter. It's light back here, and it's light here. Now, we can supplement that one of two ways. We can use a radial gradient and just put it in right here like this and brighten it up. We would have to extend this out a little bit because it is hitting a few more places, but the brightest part is in the center, and then it gets lighter as it falls off. So a radial gradient really doesn't work here. So what we need to do is use a linear gradient. Well, how do we do that when if we put a linear gradient in, it's also going to affect this area down here? So this is how we do it. We have our linear gradient here, and I'm going to make this excessively dark so you can see it better. All right, so we do want this area to be dark, and we want this area up here to be light. So now we're going to grab a second linear gradient, and we're going to come up here. We're going to move it up into this area that we want the light to be. All right, we don't want it hitting these rocks too much. We just want to light up this area. And what we do now is that we increase the exposure so we can see what we want. And as we do that, of course, it's lighting up this area down here. But we're going to fix that. So we light up our center area, disregarding the bottom. And then we go to this mask, mask 7, which was the light, and we hit subtract by linear gradient. And now we draw another gradient here. And you can see it takes away that part of the gradient that we don't want to appear. And in doing that, it also gives it a lot greater feather here. Because if we look at this, you can see the area we're affecting now. All right, and if we move this up, again, we're not affecting everything down here. And if we were, all we have to do is decrease our feather until we're getting just the area we want affected. Right there. And then we can make our exposure changes, and it only affects that part. So we put our first linear gradient in, which was really for the bottom part, which is this right here. Then we put a second linear gradient in so we could affect the part by the rock, and then we use a linear gradient to subtract from the middle gradient. All right. So now that we have this gradient in place, this subtraction, we can then increase the light. We could probably add just a little gold to it, about like this. Next thing I want to do is get rid of some of this brightness over here on the side, and we're just going to use a brush to highlight the area, to mask it away, and then we'll just take down the highlights and the exposure to where it's a little darker and not really grabbing our attention off to the side. So we're going to take highlights down about like this, maybe take the whites down a little bit and the exposure down just a little bit, about like that. So it's still showing the red rocks that are around it, it's just not as bright. So that's before, that's after, that's before, and that's after. I also would like to highlight this rock a little bit. I mean, we have a good contrast change, but I think we could make it better and add more color and grit to it. So I'm going to take a new brush, and I'm just going to make sure my flow is at 100%, and I'm just going to start painting in on the dark area of the rocks. And when you have auto mask on, auto mask is looking at tonality changes and it's looking at color changes. So that's why, even though both of these are red, it's not flowing into the light area because it's a different tone. Okay, so once we have that, I want to lighten this up just a little bit. I want to go to my effects and put some clarity and texture in there. See how these rocks are starting to pop out for us? I might even take the saturation down just a little bit. You could go to point color even and click on that and see if taking the saturation down here, it doesn't look real well. But we'll make it about like that. Then once we've done that, we're going to do another new brush, and we're just going to paint in on the bright areas so we can make changes there. And once they're all painted in, then we can just add a little tiny bit of exposure maybe and take the highlights down. And again, go to effects and texture, just to make those rocks pop just a little bit more. And let's take the exposure down just a little bit more. So we still have a light change between dark and light, but now we have, you can see here, we can see more of that rock. It has more texture. Same way here. It's not quite as dark, and it brings out the texture of the rock. It makes it look just a little bit better. From this point, I would probably want to put a vignette on, and I do that with a radial gradient. Shrink the photo down, put a big radial gradient on about like this, invert it, and then turn the exposure down. Let me bring the picture back up. And as you can see, we're putting a nice vignette on. You can control or protect areas of your vignette. If they're hitting too much in the sky, then you can use your highlights to protect them a little more, about like this. If you wanted like more vignette in the bottom, of course that's darker, so you could use your shadows like this to bring it in. Then also, I always like to use a spot. So I'm going to use another radial gradient. I'm going to put it about right here. I'm going to turn it a little sideways like this. And I'm going to give it just a very light touch of exposure, about like this. You can see, while it's not real evident to your viewer, it's real evident to us. And it just draws the eyes in just a little better. So this would be our vignette, which does a good job of bringing our eyes in toward the subject. But the spotlight in Mask 12, that just brings it home just a little bit better. Now, I like the way the picture looks right now. To me, this looks a little off, and I like to use a little, some pictures like this, I prefer to use a little less clarity. So if we bring the clarity down, you see we get a kind of an ethereal look, but I don't want it over everything. I want to kind of protect the photograph in some other areas. So what I do is I'm going to grab a linear gradient. I'm going to bring it down about like this. And this is where I'm going to apply my clarity. I'm going to bring just a little in. You don't want to give it a lot. About like this. So it gives just a homey or warm feel of the rocks. And then I also want it on the bottom. So what I can do is I can take this and say duplicate and invert the map. Duplicate and invert. So now it duplicates it and puts it on the bottom half. All I have to do is move it to the area where I want it to be applied. Remember, I don't want it in the center. I just want the bottom and the top. And then I can bring my clarity down about like this. So now I have clarity up in this mask right here. Let's see if we put a little dehaze on it. No, that's not going to do us any good. Oop. And then I have my other clarity in this linear gradient down here. And I can put a little more on here. Let's see if we just add a little shadows in there too, about like that. Brings it up just a little bit more. So real quick, this is what I do. Now, when you're processing a photo, when you get to this point, and you can see your before, and after, the best thing to do is just step away for the rest of the day, or at least a couple hours, and then come back to your photograph and look at it again. And I guarantee you, when you look at it a second time, you're going to say something like, well, what was I thinking about the red of this rocks, or the exposure, or the vignette, or how I made the trees look? It's always going to be something, because your eyes get used to seeing the photograph as you're processing, and until you step away, you don't really get a good look at your photograph, believe it or not. Well, anyway, that was a quick post-processing using some of our features that we've learned over the last several months. If anybody has any questions, please let me know. Also, if anybody has any critiques about this photograph, what they would have done different, or what they would have liked to see done different, please drop me a note. I love hearing stuff like that. We only get better when others look at our photographs and gives us an idea of something that we never thought of before. All right. Well, I hope this helped everybody out, and I can't wait to see you all again.